Welcome back. President Donald Trump's executive order on immigration has sparked protests across the nation, including here in Seattle. We've been talking about that this week. Trump and his administration say the order itself will keep the U.S. safer. Opponents say it's unconstitutional. So there's a lot to talk about with so much about immigration. A lot of people are wondering, how does the process now even work? So we thought we would help you break that down. Christopher Strawn is here. He is the director at the Immigration Law Clinic in Seattle, also a professor at the University of Washington. Thank you for taking the time. I know there's a lot going on right now.
Thank you for having me. Happy to explain what I can.
Yeah, and I know there are so many layers of this, but if you can, just kind of walk us through what is the immigration process like? If somebody wanted to move to the U.S., what do they do?
Well, it really depends on what the basis is that you're claiming to be able to come here for. So if you're a refugee, for example, a person who's been highlighted by these orders, there's a very thorough and rigorous vetting process. So it's described often as a 21-step process. It involves interviews by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, contractors for the U.S. government, United States Citizenship and Immigration Services officers also interviewing the person, as well as, at this point, it's really for all classes of people coming to the U.S. They're subject to biometric checks, so they're fingerprinted, they do name, date of birth, place of birth checks against a multitude of agency databases, so not only the Department of State, but the FBI, DEA, Interpol. And if anybody has a flag that pops up, then cases are sent for additional screening, additional processing.
How long does that process typically take? And we're talking specifically for refugees.
So for refugees, for example, they're often described as the most thoroughly vetted of the immigrant categories. The process generally takes 18 to 24 months, and that's really when you don't have any hiccups. If for some reason a flag comes up in your case, some association that the U.S. government would be worried about, then usually the case is stalled for further investigation. So most people who have been coming over here on visas more recently have been waiting quite a while and have been in the process for quite a while as well.
How is that different from immigration?
So if I'm coming on a tourist visa, for example, I still would be submitting an application, and I have to prove that I'm admissible to come as a tourist. It's my burden. And I would be fingerprinted, so a 10-point fingerprint scan, as well as the name and biometric checks. And as long as no flags come about because of that, then I could be given that tourist visa. And then again, when I come to the border, I'm fingerprinted, and if there are any flags at that point, I could have my visa revoked and be turned back. So even for relatively casual entrants coming on temporary visitor visas, there is a relatively rigorous process and a screening process.
Is it different based on region, or is it a uniform
So
system?
there are some differences. There are certain countries, we label them developed countries, Europe, Chile, Australia, who are part of the visa waiver program. So those individuals don't have to apply for an actual visa and have a visa interview when they're just coming as tourists. However, since the Obama administration, there was an added level of security, an electronic application that needed to be filed before you could benefit from the visa waiver program as well.
So when President Donald Trump signed this executive order, talked about his intent with everything that we've been talking about in the news, it's become very politicized on both sides of the issue. There are some people who have come out, some of our viewers even, who are saying it makes them feel safer. That's something that they applaud him for. Others call it unconstitutional, and it worries them. What is your perspective as someone who's worked in immigration for your entire career?
Yeah, for people who work in immigration law, I think especially the 7-country ban and the refugee ban is very concerning, because we didn't really see a problem in the screening process. Over the last 2 administrations, really the clearances and the security provisions have been increased significantly, as well as the technology really allows for a lot more capability to do clearances. So we haven't really seen that as an issue. The people, as the security issue, really what we're seeing as a result of this policy is not that we're stopping people who we have security concerns about, but we're really kind of keeping people who've already gone through the vetting away from family and jobs and so on. So our concern, I think, is that we have a problem that didn't really, or something that wasn't really a problem. It didn't seem like it needed a fix, and instead we've created bigger issues. and as well as raising legal issues, which have resulted in, I don't know if it's fair to say unprecedented, but certainly startling to have the Attorney General of Washington State now file suit, the acting head of the Department of Justice very briefly saying, I can't enforce this law, I have questions about its constitutionality.
So how do we speak to people who are still worried? I mean, I think what gets lost in these conversations is that people believe one thing very strongly, they believe another thing strongly, and we just kind of yell at each other for a while. So I really want to speak to people who are worried about this, because I know that I want to give everybody a voice in this conversation. It's a very tough one. What would you say to people who have listened to your interview, have listened to what you say, and they say, but I'm still worried, I'm still concerned? What would you say to either tell them they're right or that maybe there's not as much to worry about?
I think that certainly everybody is concerned about national security, and I think it does a bit of a disservice to the prior administrations to suggest that those weren't concerns going forward. So unfortunately, I feel like we've been stoking fears that aren't very realistic, and my concern is that we're really spending resources on kind of addressing issues that aren't as much of a problem as opposed to kind of targeting the problems that we see. So, for example, I'd say in general, most people working in immigration law would say, we don't want to have these really wide nets. We want to instead try and focus on and identify any individuals who we have suspicions about. And it just becomes harder if we don't dedicate resources to those individuals as opposed to dedicating resources so broadly.
Wow, it's a complicated issue. We really appreciate you unpacking it for us and helping, hopefully, all of us understand a different perspective. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me here.
Christopher Strawn, director at the Immigration Law Clinic in Seattle, professor at University of Washington. Back over to you, Bill.